Hello everyone, I'm Austin Wallace and this is my presentation on my research proposal. The title is A Quantitative Study on Learned Helplessness and Its Effects on Students' Math Performance. First thing we have to do is define learned helplessness, and it's basically giving up in the face of repeated failure. And the reason there's a picture of a mouse, learned helplessness was first tested on animal subjects. It began with dogs and then moved on to mice, I think. So the definition for the purposes of this study, the conceptual definition of learned helplessness is repeated failure and lack of support leads a student to give up too easily and or become overly dependent on others. And the operational definition is student's performance on tests is at odds with his or her IQ. An important caveat about that, a discrepancy between IQ and test scores can also be due to a learning disability. So I tried to weed that out. I thought it might be a confounding variable. My two research questions. One, does learned helplessness predict student outcomes on math tests? And two, does a treatment for learned helplessness improve student outcomes on a specific math test? And my hypotheses, one, learned helplessness will negatively correlate with student scores on math tests. And then the null hypothesis, there's no relationship between learned helplessness and math test scores. Hypothesis two, the prescribed intervention for learned helplessness will lead to an improvement on students' scores on a math test. And again, the null hypothesis, there will not be any relation between learned helplessness intervention and student scores on the math test. What I would expect the data to look like if learned helplessness does negatively correlate with math test scores, then it would look like the graph on the left. As learned helplessness goes up, the test scores would go down. And then if the intervention is successful in treating learned helplessness, it would look like the graph on the right. The more intervention would lead to more improvement on the math test scores. So this is my study design. I would try to weed out students with below and above average IQs and also students with a diagnosed learning disability. And then I would choose 80 students from among eligible sixth grade students. All these students would take three tests. First, they would take the IAR, which is the instrument to measure learned helplessness. Then they would take a general test of math ability, and then a pretest on solving two variable equations using the substitution method. Then after they had all taken this test, they would be randomly selected and placed into an experimental group or a control group. The experimental group would receive an intervention package to ameliorate learned helplessness and teaching on how to solve equations using substitution. So the details on the intervention package, it would have three parts. First part is a task analysis, which is a written list of steps on how to solve the equations using substitution. That would be faded over time. The second part, the students would set goals and track their progress, so hopefully they could see improvement over time. In the third part, they would do a sort of growth mindset mantra. At the beginning of the lessons, they would say, I'm a hard worker, I can succeed if I try hard. Then the control group, they would receive only the teaching component and not the intervention package. Then after 2 weeks of daily instruction, all students would take three tests. They would take the IAR again to measure learned helplessness. They would take a post-test on solving equations using substitution. Then they would take the pre-test for the next unit, which would be solving equations using elimination. The reason for taking the pre-test on the next unit is to see how it compared with the post-test, because if the students improved on the post-test, maybe it was just due to improve performance through just practicing the skill. So the data analysis, there would be two sets of variables. The first independent variable would be the degree of learned helplessness, and the dependent variable would be test scores. Second set of variables, the independent would be the intervention package for learned helplessness. That would be either they got it or they didn't, so it's a dichotomous variable. And the dependent, again, is the test scores. And then I would compare a couple different data sets. I would compare the pretest and the post-test. I would compare the IAR pre and post intervention, and I would compare the two pretests, the substitution versus elimination method of solving equations. And that, again, is just to see whether some of the students just got better through practice. How would I analyze the data? I would use, I'm not sure, I would just try to use all of them, I think. I would do the chi-square test to see if the null hypotheses are true. I would do the pair sample t-test. That would be to compare the pre and post test results. And then I would use MANOVA. That would be to check for correlations between the independent variables. I think it would generally just be to see if there's any interaction between the variables. What are the limitations of this study? One, the results might be compromised if some of the students have undiagnosed learning disabilities. Two, the study might not generalize to students with above or below average IQs. And three, the IAR may not be a perfect instrument to measure learn helplessness. It seems like a somewhat subjective thing, and it's somewhat difficult to measure. What are the implications of the study? If there's a negative correlation between learn helplessness and math scores, that would mean that teachers would probably need special training on how to mitigate learn helplessness. And then if there's a positive correlation between the intervention and test scores, then math teachers would need to further emphasize growth mindset, because basically that is an effective treatment against learn helplessness. And that's my presentation. Thanks.